Hello and welcome back to my Goofy and Dumb horror movie series, this being the 5th entry. I'm going to be covering even more stupid horror movies in this series, so let's dive right in. This might be the only horror movie besides its sequel that has a killer wearing a baby mask, all black clothes, and a plot that reminds me way too much of Groundhog Day. On the scare factor, this movie might be like a 2, because again, the killer wears a freaking baby mask. They didn't need to come up with something as brilliant as the Michael Myers mask, but bro, just go to a hardware store and come up with something. I don't care. Although I do have to give this movie credit for having one of the highest Rotten Tomato scores out of all the movies we'll be reviewing today. You think I'm joking when I say the scores get all the way down to 7%. That's worse than the 1997 Batman and Robin. There is probably around a 94% chance that the only reason you hear people talking about this movie in a conversation is because it doesn't have Michael Myers. That's probably the only reason they talk about it and the only reason they ever will talk about it. This movie has a pretty strange plot compared to the other Halloween movies, with an evil group of toy makers banding together to create masks that will melt on Halloween. Wow. This movie is one of the least violent in the franchise, with some of the only gore being when the kids' faces get melted off by the mask. Jeez, what? Now this is the movie that you saw in the intro to this video, but it's also the movie that I mentioned has a rating of 7% on Rotten Tomatoes. Seriously, how do you do this? I mean, then there's Jack Frost 2, which has a rating of 0%. But we're not going to talk about that right now. Ghoulies is actually the first ripoff of Gremlins to my knowledge, being released in 1985. As you guys already know, I am way too lazy to go over this movie or any of its sequels, so we'll just get right over to the next one. This is the movie that I am ashamed to admit I picked over Zoolander, which was one of the dumbest choices in my entire life. This movie pretty much bores me to tears, even though there is a killer snake on the loose throughout the entire story. I also made the dumb mistake of picking this movie over the reboot, because at the time I thought it was a remake, and remakes usually suck. Although the reboot is actually supposed to be way funnier than this bitter, boring film. Tusk is about a walrus, and that's all I have the courage to say about it. Sleepaway Camp is one of those special movies that was stupid enough to rip off the Friday the 13th franchise, but let's dive in and figure out how this movie went down. By the time Sleepaway Camp came out in 1982, Jason Voorhees had already acquired his iconic hockey mask in Friday the 13th Part 3, which also came out in 1982. Although instead of having a hockey mask-wearing killer like you'd expect, this movie's killer is revealed at the end to be Peter Baker, and I can't hate on this movie too much since it has 82% on Rotten Tomatoes. Pretty good. If I told you there was a ripoff of A Nightmare on Elm Street, you'd probably believe me. But if I told you there was an Indian ripoff of A Nightmare on Elm Street, would you believe me? Probably not, but it does exist. Mahakal is basically the same thing as A Nightmare on Elm Street, except with worse effects, and the killer looks just the slightest bit different, although it's basically the same thing. I'm just gonna let it sink in that they somehow found a way to make 4 of these goofy Leprechaun movies. How do you do it? You couldn't pay me to make a movie as weird as this one. So you got the Leprechaun talking to bald cyborg-like people, and the Leprechaun brutally kicking people in the groin. This movie goes places, that's all I'm gonna tell you. But like Ghoulies and that Bollywood Freddy Krueger ripoff before, I barely know anything about this movie, so let's just put me out of my misery and move on to the next one. So you know how I was talking about Halloween 3 earlier? You know how the Halloween franchise has some bad movies? Well, now we're going to talk about Halloween Kills, so grab some popcorn and let's get right into it. Halloween Kills is one of those movies where the only thing people really remember about it is that it was really stupid, and of course the infamous fireman scene where Michael Myers literally just slaughters a bunch of firemen that pretty much line up to get killed. Sure, there's a few returning characters from the original 1978 movie, but other than that, this movie doesn't seem to get a lot of good reviews. Anyways, this has been my Goofy and Dumb Horror Movies Part 5 video. If you have any suggestions for Part 6, make sure to comment down below if you have any stupid horror movies. Other than that, though, I'll see you guys in the next one.